Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to continue with Chapter 5, An Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, and this chapter is entitled The Trials of Girlhood. In this chapter, Harriet Jacobs informs us that she is 15 years of age, and at this age is when she started having trouble with her slave master, Dr. Flint, pursuing her for sex. Now, he didn't just rape her, even though if he did rape her, this chapter informs us that the murderer of a slave in North Carolina would not be prosecuted for homicide, nor did the law protect a slave woman from rape. So, if Dr. Flint would have raped Harriet Jacobs, he could not be prosecuted for it. However, he didn't rape her, but he pursued her, and he wanted her to submit to him as her slave master. So, in his process, she explains in this chapter, which many people can relate to today, that he pursued her everywhere she went. Now today we call that a stalker, but in this chapter she says that if she went out for a breath of fresh air, there he was. If she went out to her mother's grave to just visit her mother's grave, he was there telling her, "I'm your master, I could have you, you're my property, I could do with you whatever I want." And if she was tired after a long day's work, he was always around the corner harassing her. And through this pursuance, like, it's kind of sickening because he's the master, full power over her, and he's 35 years older than her. In this chapter, she says he's 40 years my senior, but they got the notes to say that he was actually 35 years older than she was. So she was 15 and he was 35 years older than she was, pursuing her. Now, in this chapter, she says the only reason why he didn't just all out rape her was because of her grandmother. Now, at this age, her grandmother is a free woman, and as we learned from the previous chapters, that her grandmother was well respected in this community. And Harriet Jacobs' master, he's Dr. Flint. He's a doctor, so a doctor has to have some sense of decency in his reputation, so he didn't flat out rape her. Now, as we read further through each chapter, and every chapter she continues to say he pursued her. Like, I'm willing to bet that on some occasion or other he did just flat out take advantage of her. However, from reading this narrative, she never comes flat out and says things that occurred that are explicit like that, because back in that time period they just didn't, well, at least she didn't speak like that. And she even talks about in this chapter she couldn't confide in anyone, and she was afraid to tell her grandmother what was going on for two reasons. One reason was because what I just stated, it was back then they just didn't talk explicitly about these things because it was like an insult to their womanhood. But the other interesting reason, she says, is because her grandmother once went after a white man with a loaded pistol for insulting one of her daughters. Now, that's very interesting, because even nowadays we know that to protect our kids, or to protect someone that we love, sometimes we don't care about what the law says. We're just going to go out to get revenge. And she said that her grandmother went after a white gentleman, as she stated, with a loaded pistol for insulting one of her daughters. So Dr. Flint never flat out raped Harriet Jacobs as of yet. And well, there's another reason why she said she never told anyone or confided in anyone, was because Dr. Flint told her that if she uttered to anyone what was going on, that he would kill her. And as I read before, a white man killing a slave will not be prosecuted. A white man for raping a slave woman will not be prosecuted. And the interesting thing about this chapter is Harriet Jacobs reveals exactly who she's speaking for, who her audience is. So I'm going to read some interesting sections, but first I just want to read about how she was feeling. And this is about, she mentions in this, she doesn't mention directly, but she reveals about the laws that the death of a slave meant nothing. And then she mentions the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, she doesn't call it the Fugitive Slave Act, but that's what she's referencing. And I'll read it to you, and then I'll read the footnote of what it says about the Fugitive Slave Law. Okay. He told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny. But where could I turn for protection? No matter whether the slave girl be as black as ebony or as fair as her mistress, in either case there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death. All these are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men. The mistress, who ought to protect the helpless victim, has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage. The degradation, the wrongs, the vices that grow out of slavery are more than I can describe. They are greater than you would willingly believe. Surely, if you credited one half of the truths that are told you concerning the helpless millions suffering in this cruel bondage, you at the North would not help to tighten the yoke. You surely would refuse to do for the masters on your own soil the mean and cruel work which trained bloodhounds and the lowest class of whites do for him at the South. So she mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act, and what it says about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 says, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 required that all citizens aid in the capture and return of runaway slaves. Under the law, those who assisted or harbored runaways risked fines and imprisonment. And further than that, if you were walking down the street as a white man and a slave was running, for his freedom, and if you did not help at that instance to catch that slave, like if the slave ran past you and you somehow impeded it, you would be subject to fine and imprisonment for not helping to catch that slave. That's how ruthless the Fugitive Slave Act was. And Harriet Jacobs, throughout this book, she references that. And then in other sections of this chapter, which is only 4 pages long, she says, like, oh, what days and nights of fear and sorrow that man caused me. Reader, it is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I am telling you truthfully what I suffered in slavery. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage, suffering as I once suffered. So there she's telling you that her audience is people in the North, to have compassion for what her sisters, which are black women in the South in slavery, are suffering. And then she goes further to say in the last paragraph, in view of these things, why are ye silent, ye free men and women of the North? Why do your tongues falter in maintenance of the right? Would that I had more ability, but my heart is so full and my pen is so weak. There are noble men and women who plead for us, striving to help those who cannot help themselves. God bless them. God give them strength and courage to go on. God bless those everywhere who are laboring to advance the cause of humanity. So you see who her audience is, and we've spoke on other videos where when you're reading a text, it's very important to know who the author is, the message being conveyed to the author, which Harriet Jacobs is telling of her life as a woman on the slave plantation. She also mentions, men like her uncle getting his freedom and then her other uncle gaining his freedom when her grandmother purchased her. But her main interest is for those to have compassion for the women in the South suffering as she suffered, because she feels as a woman she can demonstrate through her writings that which women go through. Now, when Frederick Douglass in his narrative was very masculine and told of what men go through, what he went through, and he was very graphic about it. Her narrative is much more emotional, where she talks about women being pursued by the slave master relentlessly. And some of you who are watching these videos know how it feels to be stalked by someone. And if you want to, just leave a little comment in the comment section about that, because you can feel what she's talking about. Now, another interesting thing about this was when she was talking about the mistresses who are supposed to protect the woman, only feels jealousy and rage. And this is really interesting, because women feel that other women should feel compassion for what they go through. But again, these white mistresses, they hate these slave girls, especially if the slave girl is very beautiful. And in this chapter, she says that beauty bestowed upon a white woman is a blessing, and beauty bestowed upon the slave woman is a curse, because that slave woman will be raped, pursued, stalked, everything, enough to drive her crazy and make her life miserable. And she says from the age of 12, many of the slave children start to be pursued by their masters, and they hear all of this jealousy and all this rage directed at them, and many times directed at their mothers. So the slave master, like you grow up and you hear, and these women are mad at these slaves because either their master, the slave master, is sleeping with these women, making babies, or these babies are the offspring of the slave master. And the mistress just knows that all of this adultery is going on right under her roof, and she can do nothing about it. But instead of having compassion for these slaves who are at no fault, for the most part, of these relationships, you know, she doesn't feel any compassion for them. She feels jealousy and rage. And I say for the most part, because as we read on further, like not all of these slave women are innocent. And she kind of brings up, she didn't say that they're not innocent, but she says that many of the slave women, you know, many of them fall apart because of what's going on, but then some of them just use that their sexuality and that sex for favor. So they actually just, you know, kind of flip the script and just use it. They're actually pursue the slave master because he's the one that has the power and she's powerless. So in order to gain some type of power, she believes that a sexual submission to the slave master will help her. And we read that in the previous chapter that I covered, where the slave woman's husband was upset with her, with his wife, because he believed that she just submitted to the slave master. And they both were punished for just fighting out in the public and all of this relationships being revealed. Because as we know, and in this chapter, Harriet Jacob mentions it, that if any of this came to light, number one, Dr. Flint threatened to kill her, but she also mentions that if any of this comes out to the public, it never goes unpunished. But one other thing I want to mention is that when she said that sometimes these slave girls hear their mothers being the object of the mistress's rage and jealousy, that same slave daughter she has to be weary of her master's footsteps as well. So there's a lot of incest and stuff going on in these little small towns because these slave masters, they don't recognize these slave, he doesn't recognize his mixed children as legitimate children. So, and in many cases, the slave master has his own kids with his mistress, and the males of the slave master used to practice their sexual prowess and their, you know, practice for marriage with the slaves, and in many cases, those were their own brothers and sisters that they were getting with. So that all of that stuff happened during slavery. And all of that stuff happens even nowadays in these little small towns where people don't know who's brothers and sisters and things like that. So if that goes on today, you can imagine how much it went on during this time period. So this chapter is very important, and it's an introduction, the trials of girlhood. This chapter 5. And then in chapter 6, it talks about the jealous mistress, and I will read that chapter. It's on the second page. It said, I had entered my 16th year, and every day it became more apparent that my presence was intolerable to Miss Flint. So she talks about this, she goes more in depth about the jealousy and rage that these mistresses inflict. And it's very important that we have narratives like Harriet Jacobs to tell us what went on with these mistresses, because many times when we talk about slavery, when we have discussions about slavery, we're talking about, you know, Frederick Douglass, the men and the whips and the hangings and all of that stuff, but we don't focus on the mistresses and these white women and the part that they had in slavery, in the Reconstruction, in Jim Crow. And if you look at the pictures of the Civil Rights Movement, it seems that these white women were a lot more vocal at these rallies and stuff than the men were. You know, the men were calling the shots because they were the ones in power, but we all know that a lot of big decisions and stuff are made behind closed doors in the bedrooms, talking with our spouses and loved ones. So Harriet Jacobs, the next chapter, she's going to talk about the jealousy and rage of the slave mistress. And it's called The Jealous Mistress on chapter 6. So that's the next thing we're going to talk about. This is Jason Williams, Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.